Yeah, so this is, what is today? December 8th, 2021, Calico community meeting. We've got a few things to check in on, some issues to triage. I know we've got some discussion around VPP and stuff like that. So why don't we start with the VPP discussion this week? Because we were starting to chat a little bit about that before we got kicked off officially. So yeah, I think the first thing's probably that operator PR, where it's looking 98, 99% good to go. The last question was around this like Felix config option to disable source desk checks in AWS. And I wanted to get your thoughts on it, Eric. Seems fine to me. The only thing I thought was maybe, I know we were planning on stopping using environment variables for configuring all of that to allow users to tweak config. The problem with the environment variables is that when they're set by the operator, you can't, like, they're the highest precedence config model option. So nobody can ever change them if they want to for some reason. So we're trying to steer clear away from that.
Sorry, I don't remember. Is that a Felix one?
It is, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, what's your question? Should we switch it over? I mean, sure.
Well, I was asking, I couldn't remember how far we were along on like making that easy to do in the operator. I don't want to like strap Hoes with
yeah.
this architectural change to enable that if we haven't got that.
I mean, we do it for, well, I don't remember the exact flag that we do it for, but we do have some that, or at least one that we set. Well, I think it kind of comes directly from an installation or some other operator resource setting that it sets it in Felix config. So I mean, I think we have that machinery to set those or at least have examples of how to do it. So I don't think it would be too burdensome.
Okay. So I can look at switching to the Felix configuration object.
Yeah, I think the main thing is the experience we want is that if somebody has explicitly set that to do nothing or enable, then we want to respect that user's choice that they're managing that some other way.
So I guess that part we don't have in there then, Casey.
Okay.
We don't really have a way right now to, we haven't started using, what is it, that fields or whatever to see who set it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't have that. So yeah, I don't think we can, I guess, yeah, can't do it yet.
So just maybe a question, but regarding what you just said, Casey, isn't that a bit a departure from the operator model where the operator tries to keep the resources under control based on a higher level user config? Wouldn't it be more likely that the user should tweak the installation configuration and then have that reflected in the Felix configuration?
You could look at it that way. One of the things, this is tricky, right? Because we've got these sort of APIs that have existed for a long time in Felix config and IP pools and BGP config and all of this. And it's confusing to users to have two different ways to do the same thing. So unless we're going to deprecate all of Felix config and move it into the installation resource, which we're not going to do, at least not anytime soon, then we're kind of stuck with picking one or the other for config options like this. And we've not struck that balance super well so far, but I think the direction we want to be going is like keeping them separate APIs. So if you want to configure something in Felix config, you do it in Felix config. There's some exceptions that make that rule. Like there are certain things where we know, look, if you're running in this mode, you need this set this way. And if you don't do it, it doesn't work. End of story. There's no reason ever to set that to a different value. Those sorts of things maybe we can do with environment variables.
The Kubernetes server-side apply stuff is supposed to help with those kinds of problems where you have an operator that needs to set something a certain way, so it sets the flag and it marks it as owned by itself in the metadata, and then you kind of have that tracked. But I don't know, it's a really tough problem.
Yeah, that's I think what we were just talking about with the managed field stuff, is that we want our operator to see what fields it has set and what fields somebody else has set. And that way it's not going to step on somebody else's config, but still give it the ability to set its own config and let users overwrite that if they so choose. And we've always got environment variables for things that we really just don't want to allow to be overridden. But even that's not a good user experience, because we set that environment variable, somebody says, I want to change that, and they modify the Felix config API resource, and then they see no change happens because the environment variable takes precedence, and it's confusing. So yeah, that's sort of where my head's at least on that, and I think Eric's as well, as we've talked about this a lot in the past.
Yeah, I mean, if you're concerned about that specifically, Casey, I mean, we could certainly have the operator watch the Felix config and check that, see if that, well, I don't know. Can we check if it's disabled in that Felix config? If it's disabled, it might look the same as if they never set it, right? So I guess maybe that it isn't really too feasible to have the operator check that it's not different, I guess.
Yeah, I think it gets pretty awkward if you're trying to read that and compare it to the operator's defaults and set, like, I don't know what the right behavior would be.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one problem with just taking what Eloise, as you suggested, like that we take the config and, set that field. Well, that field isn't like, I don't think it's directly settable from any of our current config. Like we're assuming that, it should be set based on, I think from what I remember in the PR, if it's VPP and what the
EKS, I think.
Is it EKS? Yeah. So I mean, maybe that is specific enough that we can be sure of it. In this case, does EKS always add the those required configuration that it needs?
Yeah, the IAM profiles are always added by default in EKS.
Okay.
So we're sure it doesn't harm to have this option enabled. But then, yes, as Casey says, we are removing the possibility for a user to explicitly disable, or explicitly re-enable this source test check if they know that they are in a configuration for which it works fine.
Yeah, and I admit that that's sort of, I think, a niche scenario, but I can imagine somebody wanting to remove that IAM permission or tweak them around and do things in their own way.
In EKS, the IAM permission for removing the source desk check is going away. I think maybe that's where they started, but it used to be the EKS Cuttle would grant all of the permissions to the node, but the AWS CNI is now moving to the new permissions model for Kubernetes, where it doesn't get granted to the node.
Yeah, so that might be a reason
Yeah, so
to.
does that is that even more reason to not set it?
Yeah, potentially. I wasn't aware of that. But okay.
So maybe we should pull that out for now, just because it's sort of up in the air, and we should be able to document a patch command in the docs. It's like a one-liner that sets that to the right value in the API resource.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't be too complex for users, but still lets them set it to the value we want.
Okay. Sounds good to me.
And after that, I think we can ship that PR.
I have no idea if this would be feasible, but we wouldn't want to try to add smarts into the operator to understand if it could, based on permission. I mean, see if it had or if it thought permissions were there and set it if so. I don't. That might be too much. I don't know.
Yeah, I need to think about that some more. I certainly don't want to make Alois have to do that. So let's go with the simplest option for now, and then we should look at adding that generic infrastructure for setting Felix config and allowing users to override it so that we can make this easier in the future. What else we got for VPP? I think you guys were saying there's some Malta stuff you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so maybe first we can do a quick release check because we have the host policy support, which is finally getting ready.
Okay, sorry, can I? I meant to say something earlier. Casey, do we want to be taking? I don't know if anybody's taking notes. Are we still doing that?
I forgot to. Yeah, we should still be doing that.
We kind of changed the format a little, and I didn't know if that went to the wayside.
No, we still should be taking notes. I just didn't ask for a volunteer.
Because I don't want Alois to go through all that and not record it if we wanted to.
Yeah. I'll try to summarize the operator discussion a bit in there, but if
I can do it going forward from this point, and then if we can just retrofit the previous stuff in there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah.
I go for it, otherwise. So yeah, you were.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so host policy is finally coming to Calico VPP. Just one last thing to fix in the PR, and it should be merged tomorrow, I think. And we are likely gonna do an intermediate release with that. So still using Calico 3.20. I don't remember what's the latest. 2, maybe. But anyway, yeah, latest released Calico version. So that's gonna be nice, and hopefully we can start testing all of this stuff and ensure, yeah, it works as expected. It's yeah, well, getting it out there so that it sees a bit of use. And for the next release, which is likely going to accompany the next Calico release 3.21, we're likely going to include some improvements that Nathan made, performance improvements. I don't know if Nathan want to talk a bit about that.
Sure, I think I already mentioned it a bit last time. The main goal of those improvements was to improve the PPS performance we can get with the MEMIFs exposed in the pods. Being able to get a bit closer to what a raw MEMIF can do. Order of magnitude being 10 million packets per second per core on VP. And before that, we were more around 4 or 5. So basically, it's just adds a layer of caching of the. So you do the lookup once, and then you take all the decisions based on which flow is this, and you propagate decisions. But this is quite a refactoring of the Q-proxy logic, so we might want to hold a bit before merging this to not break everything in the air. Although it passes some tests, but we're never too sure.
Yeah, especially when you say some tests.
Yeah.
It implies that all don't pass, but
Yep. And we don't know which one. That's the key point.
That's funny.
Passes some tests some of the times, never all the tests.
Yeah.
I get that. You guys have you demoed that MEMIF stuff yet on here?
So there was a demo I did on Calico Live.
Okay.
But that's the only one I think we did.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, there's a recording of that.
We were talking about that at one point, but I wasn't sure if that had happened yet.
We've talked a lot about it at KubeCon, but there wasn't a demo at that point. Yeah.
What's the status of the Malta stuff at the moment?
Oh, Malta stuff. So it's something we started working on first as an internal initiative to for our internal needs. But we were wondering if it was worth bringing it to the community. If you want, I have a small presentation I can go through that shows a bit the idea. Yeah, should I go through it?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Let me share my screen. Well. Need to grant permissions. I might need to reconnect again. That's weird.
I checked. It should let you share.
Yeah. Sorry. I will have to disconnect and reconnect again.
It's the Zoom permissions on Mac. First time you share.
I see. Not admin permissions, but his. Yeah.
Okay. Can you guys see this slide?
Looks good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so this is just an introduction slide, nothing new for you guys, but basically just a reminder that Kubernetes is a single layer 3 network. But what we're seeing is that we have a need for some class of applications to be able to connect them to different isolated networks. And so to have one application which has access to different interfaces, both for security and isolation reasons, and also for simplicity, because you could emulate this by managing overlays within the pod. But this puts a lot of burden on the application, which we don't really want to do because we believe that's something that the infrastructure should be responsible for. And so our idea was to try to extend the existing Kubernetes model to satisfy these requirements. And the proposal we had was to add a new layer 3 network concept in Kubernetes, so most likely using a CRD. So as a result, there would be the default network, which is the existing network as it is today, which all pods likely will have an interface into. And then we would have additional layer 3 networks, which would be completely independent from one another and from the default network. So we could even have overlapping IP addresses between these different networks. So it would be totally separate VRFs. And optionally, we could route them outside the cluster or to, using whatever we want. And we also would like to provide Kubernetes features in these networks. So service discovery, service load balancing and policies. Because the goal is really to have these applications really benefit from being deployed in a cloud native environment, in a Kubernetes cluster. And that goes in part through having access to these features. And the idea is that when you create a pod, you are able to request connectivity to any number of predefined networks available in a sort of catalog. And then the actual mechanism used to bring the packet into the pod should be configurable. Should be configurable as well. So it could be just a regular Linux network device that a standard application can use. It can also be a MIF interface, for instance, or maybe a physical SRIOV interface if you have really strict performance requirements, or the VPP host stack is another option as well. And so just to make it be a bit more concrete, here is what it could look like. So that's very preliminary. That is likely going to change, but yeah, just to give you an idea. This is what the network definition could look like. So that would be the VNI, which would be used to isolate the networks from one another. Then we need to take care of the IBAN and also maybe what routes are accessible within this network, which will correspond in practice to routes that are configured in the pod to an interface connected to that network. And the pod definition might look something like this. So this is a bit similar to what Multus is doing, albeit a bit extended. Because in addition to the network identifier, we could also, for instance, specify an interface type. And we are making room to specify other options as well if we need to in the future, such as, I don't know, QoS, things like this. And finally, for the integration with the services, there is a little trick that Danem uses. So normally in a regular Kubernetes service, there is a selector defined in the spec, and the Kubernetes server will automatically create an endpoint for this service with the list of all the pods that match this selector. What we want to do is we want to be able in a service to target a specific network. So a service would be implemented in one network and accessible only in that network. As a result, we can't use this automated mechanism from Kubernetes to manage the endpoint object, but we can manage it on our own using a separate controller. And that's why we do it. And we can do this by configuring the selector just in a notation that will be ignored by Kubernetes, but that we can process in our controller. And then we can also identify the network that we want to target. So as a result of this, the endpoint will contain the addresses of the pods that match the selector. And it will take the address that's on the interface connected to that network. So this way we make it possible to use services in one of the additional secondary layer 3 networks. And the port specification doesn't change, that's just for standard ports definition for a service. This is what a Calico VPP implementation would look like. So we would just have an additional VRF in VPP for every network that we have, well, for every network that the pod uses on the current node. And all these secondary networks would have a separate uncap between the nodes so that the traffic doesn't leak from one to another. The routes can be announced using BGP, VPN, v4 within the cluster. So that again, at the BGP layer, we have isolation between the different networks. And we can advertise their routes independently from one another. And the actual creation of the interfaces in the pod will likely be done using a Meta CNI plugin. So we've made a bit of progress in several of these slides, and it's going to be Multus, which will be used to implement to actually do the multiple CNI calls to create interfaces in the pod. So the benefits of this approach are that it abstracts the network implementation and isolation from the users.
Alois, can I just ask a question before we move back on that previous slide? So so I understand about the BGP, VPN, v4 to advertise the routes in different VRFs. What's the transport scenario between nodes? How would that be handled?
Do you mean the traffic from the different networks?
Yeah, how would the VRFs remain isolated between nodes?
So yeah, good point. It's not written here. Every one of these interfaces here between the VRFs, the network VRFs and the default VRF is, well, let's say a VXLAN VTAP. And so every network will use a separate VXLAN VNI, so that we can, when we receive a packet, we know which network to send it into, and when we send one, we just tag it with the right VNI.
And would it be possible to use a different physical infrastructure network to pin different VRFs to different physical infrastructure networks?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a bit trickier. It is possible in theory. But that's likely, well, that's a bit complex in Kubernetes because we are constrained by the fact that nodes have one primary IP address, and we use it for the routes next hop. We use it for the tunnel endpoints. And so if we have a secondary interface, we will need to use a different, well, we need to use the address that's on that interface for maybe, yeah, for the route endpoint and for the tunnel endpoint. Sorry, for the route next hop and tunnel endpoint. So that's going to add a bit of complexity. So in theory, it's possible. We may consider that in the future, but right now we are not yet looking at this.
Cool, thank you, Alois.
And one other option, which might be a bit simpler, is to, if we have one secondary interface, to just dedicate that interface to a network. And that would be simpler. But yeah, it's we have to see if there is a demand for that, and if there is, yeah, that's something we can implement as well, probably. Okay. So yeah, so this proposal allows to abstract the network implementation details from the users. They can just, like they traditionally do in maybe VM-based environments or something, just request access to several networks. But they no benefit from more features from this network because we offer all the Kubernetes services on this network. We offer automated policies and service discovery and all that stuff. We can implement it purely in software with Calico VPP and probably with other data planes as well. So that's nice because we have zero hardware dependency. We don't need to be integrated with the network fabric that the nodes are connected to, etc., etc. But if the hardware environment allows, and that's for private cloud use cases, we can also implement this model using different, well, by integrating it with a fabric using SRIOV. The only drawback of that is it makes it much harder to implement Kubernetes load balancer and policies because since we don't have this virtual router that's on the data path anymore, the load balancing and policies would need to be implemented externally. And of course, that requires an integration with the fabric so that the fabric knows what network, which interface corresponds to, etc., etc. So that's a bit more complex to put in place, but that can work as well. The point here is really that the model that we propose is independent on the implementation. We can implement it in pure software, and we can also, if required, implement it in hardware. So to clarify the difference on Multus and what we add on top of Multus, Multus just cares about connecting different interfaces to the pod, but it doesn't really care about what these interfaces are connected to, like what's on the other end of the interface. And that's traditionally left to the user to configure these interfaces properly. And in this proposal, we propose to automatically take care of the IPAM aspects, the routing aspects, automatically manage isolated networks, just like the default network is managed in Kubernetes. And with software implementation, there's absolutely no additional dependency. And so just a note on this proposal. So just like Multus in general, the pod connectivity is configured as startup, and it can't be changed during the pod lifetime. So that's one limitation to keep in mind. And that's it for the presentation. Any questions, feedback, comments?
Still thinking through it. I know we've sort of steered clear of that in the past.
Yeah.
I'm not sure where the general thinking is on that at the moment, but certainly seems like an area that is getting a bit more attention recently. So it might be time to revisit
Yeah,
it,
so
yes.
yeah, to be honest, I'm not sure either whether there is really other folks who have use cases for that or not. We are just, well, we know that we will need it for our own use cases. And if there are some other folks who are interested in that and who like to talk about making it more standard and so on, we would be happy to do so. But that's really our position right now. If there is some interest, then yeah, we were happy to work on making it a bit more standard. But if not, that's yeah, that can as well stop. So yeah.
So I think we have in our enterprise product, we kind of have some partial support for Multus and multiple interfaces and things like that. You know, customer ask, customer get kind of stuff. So don't mind putting that out there. I feel like it's something that we've kind of bolted on a little bit, and it would be nicer to have a real model for it. Like if you assume that it's going to be needed eventually, but historically we've also resisted the idea of shoehorning the kind of old style. Well, we've like forklifted something into the cloud and it had 3 interfaces that were connected to 3 physical networks when it was on-prem. So it needs to have 3 interfaces in the cloud, and then it needs to have 3 interfaces in its container. We're hoping to break that cycle of interfaces and complexity with Calico. So we're in, I'm kind of split-brained on it.
Yep.
No, that makes sense.
You know, if it's going to happen, then we should have a nice model, like, you know, networks that are nicely defined and like flow through to the pods and everything, rather than kind of cobbling it in. But on the other hand, historically, we've been in the other camp, but I feel like that's softening a bit.
Yeah. So I think you're spot on in what you're saying about we shouldn't just like if we have an application running in a VM that has 3 interfaces and we are putting it in a container, and because honestly, that's the wrong way to do a migration to Kubernetes, and you're not going to benefit from Kubernetes. You might as well just leave your application in its VM and it will work just the same. But I still think that there are some use cases for which that makes sense. And there are a bit more niche use cases, obviously. But maybe for folks like service providers who need to connect their applications to different customers and who might, for instance, have one network per customer that's in the addressing space of the customer. So that's one.
Yeah.
And another one is maybe just to, well, I mean, I still think that there is some so yeah, the point is about access control basically and policies. We can of course define policies between every set of pods and so on, but there is some value in a more traditional approach, I think, because it simplifies things, and you can just really split things in 2 different networks, and you say, okay, these 2 things never talk to each other. I just want them to be completely isolated, and I don't take the risk of having one policy misconfigured that somehow allows one pod of one to talk to one pod of another. So it kind of simplifies, I think, the access control model between pods in some cases. Again, it's probably also not generally true, but in some specific cases, it can make sense, I think.
In the case of the service provider example, why does the complexity need to come into Kubernetes? Why can't it just be a shared VRF that is root leaked into all the customer VRFs, so that the complexity can stay out of Kubernetes?
I think the problem is addressing, really, because it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to find an IP address range that's not used by any of your customers. And it's easier to just have them allocate one prefix that they give to you and that you know is completely routable in their network.
Yep.
Yeah,
I would say like the philosophy behind Calico is not like simplicity and we won't give you the feature that you want. The philosophy was more if you want to do something fiddly and you need something really fiddly like that, then only your workloads that are needing that should pay the price for it. So I think sometimes I kind of get a little bit dogmatic in my thinking, but we did sort of think that we might end up doing like overlap with my IP space and things like that at some point. It's always on the whiteboards for the initial designs of Calico, wasn't it?
Yeah. I think that I'd probably want to dive deeper into some of these use cases just to fully understand them. Like, I think this is one of those things that comes up every 6 months in a different context, and I find it pretty tough to track. Like, a lot of the use cases I've spoken to before have been very much just like, no, you don't need this, you just haven't figured out how Kubernetes networking works yet. But I would not be surprised if there are legitimate use cases that are showing up now.
So
just like there's a balance, right, between when it's a legitimate use case versus a I don't want to re-architect my app use case.
Yeah, if I can add one more comment, I think it's valuable. I know that a lot of the success that we've had, and I include my own experience directly in this, comes from the protocols that we use being stuff that people comprehend. And I know that when I compared Calico against Juniper Contrail and all kinds of other things, as soon as people start talking about VPN v4, BGP, multi-protocol BGP, stuff like this, there's a lot of people cannot get their heads around that stuff. So we have to be careful that anything we add doesn't take away the comprehensibility of the core features. But otherwise, I think it looks cool.
I think it could be added in a sort of reasonably straightforward way. Like we already create a default IP pool for the cluster, right? We could create a default network, and then if you're doing a simple use case, you would just get what you get now, and it would be exactly the same. But you would have that flexibility to create a second network. As I say, feels like someone would have to do a bit of soul searching on. I feel much more like we maybe should go in that direction more recently. Like Casey's saying, it comes up. There's people who have difficult use cases, and then there's people who just have like some hard requirement imposed on them, like they're deploying a telco application, and the telco application says you have two interfaces. You get no choice. The two interfaces must be on separate VLANs. That is how this telco protocol works. No choice, no option. If you want to be compliant, you have to do what we say, kind of thing. So I guess that's similar to what you were saying with service providers needing overlapping IP space and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, but this has lots of ramifications into a lot of different things, especially when you start adding services and so on. And honestly, I don't think we've wrapped our head around everything yet. But it's also FYI that we are working on this, and yeah. So if there is traction, we're happy to talk about other folks, and we are also happy to dive into the use cases a bit more, Casey, if you want to. But maybe that's not the right form. We've already taken a lot of time talking about VPP.
Yeah, I think we should probably excuse me, table it for now. But
yeah,
I'd like to talk about that some more and definitely see where you guys get to. And I'm sure the Multus folks and that network plumbing working group in the networking SIG would also be interested in hearing about this and maybe incorporating some of the work.
I have to step away for 1 minute. If someone can carry on notes, apologies.
Yep. So let me do just a quick check-in on 3.22, which is the next release for Calico. The summary is that we are targeting late January for that release. So it looks like we've got 2 months, but we really don't, because there's going to be a lot of time off at the end of December and early January, just with holidays and all. So that's coming up. It's got a few things in it. One of the biggest efforts we're working on right now is a sort of refactor of our repository structure to improve contributor experience. We're hoping to roll that out over the next couple of weeks as an initial MVP. And then we'll keep iterating on that probably for several release cycles into the future as we shore it up. But super excited about that. I was hoping to demo some of it, but I'm not sure if we'll have time today. That's okay, I can show it on the next one. Where hopefully it will actually be live. Other stuff, VPP beta, obviously.
Yeah, hopefully we won't have to roll it all back.
Yeah. No looking back once it's out. That's what I say. Yeah, so we talked about the operator integration stuff there. Hopefully that goes in pretty soon. Like we were saying, it's very close. Some other smaller features like a tool to convert Kubernetes policies to Calico policies, which is something we've heard a couple of times and I think will be generally useful. And then a bunch of bug fixes and other smaller enhancements that team's working on. So that's sort of the summary there. Let's see, we've got like 10 minutes left. I wanted to, before we go into the issue triage, give a shout out to, I have no idea how to say this name / GitHub handle, so I'm just going to go for it. Hanamentagud. It's probably about as bad as it can get. I'll stick a link in the notes, but he's been doing a great job with adding a new auto detection method to Calico node that a lot of people have been asking for, which is to do it based off of the Kubernetes node internal IP. And there's like half a dozen issues that this will be the solution for that I've seen over the last few months. So it's a pretty important one. Yeah, let me stick that in the notes, Eric. Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to say really nice work on that. I've been a bit picky with some of the review comments, and he's just been soldiering through it, and that should be going in very soon. Are there any other shout outs anyone wanted to do?
Is he adding it to the operator?
I haven't given him that news yet. I think that I will suggest it, but I would be happy to do that last little bit because that's the easy part.
Yeah. Cool.
And it'll be much easier once everything's all in one place.
Yeah. Let's see, should we do some look over a couple issues for the last 10 minutes? How about that? I'll just skim through. I've queued up a few if I can find the right window to share. Cool. Can you guys see this? Yes.
Calico
No,
IPP virtual interfaces? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Cool. So Lance, I think it looks like you've already commented on this one. I think you're right. Like, I'm not sure that the speed on a VEF means anything.
Yeah, it doesn't mean anything as far as I know.
Yeah. So I think that this is just a support issue. My internet would load these labels.
Pretty sure I've read through all of that code, and yeah, it doesn't do anything. Yeah, it just it's one function call.
Value.
It's a function call that goes in to send the packet down the VEF, and it kind of does a function call pretending to be the other end of the VEF, sending it on in the kernel side.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything to that.
Cool. I'll follow up and probably close that one after this. Helm chart is broken for Terraform. Looks like we got people all over this one.
Yeah, I think Matt has a fixed plan, at least, even if he hasn't written it yet.
Okay, cool. It sounds like this is actually a bug.
It depends if we think that. See, the problem with Helm is that see, as you can see from the comment, my first comment in there, Helm works fine. The problem is that Terraform's implementation of Helm doesn't. So the question is, do we actually support that? And do we want it to work? And clearly the answer is yeah, we'd like as much as possible to work.
Yeah. I think that we we want that to work.
Helm is not very specific about this stuff, and if they were more specific about what values should go into what fields, then we'd be compatible with a whole lot more things.
Yep. Cool. Next one. Global network policy does not apply rules to workload host. Trying to apply a global network policy on host endpoints. Works fine with all nodes except for workload host. Oh, is this because they're trying to talk to from a workload to its own host? That should be fine. Trying to remember what the host endpoint rules are for that. I think that if they're using...
Hey, Sean, can you mute?
yeah. I think I would need to look through these in a little more detail. Not sure we want to do a detailed review of this this GNP, but I'll assign myself to this one. Take a look. Oh, unless somebody else is also looking at this.
Is it just that you can't block a host from its own workloads?
I thought that you could, but I always have to double check the rules for that. I thought it was the other direction that we had an explicit allow for.
I think it's kubelet health checking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is the use case. So that would be workload to pod,
that
right?
would be host to workload.
Yeah.
And they're having trouble with workload to host, right?
Right. Okay. Cool. I've got that backwards. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not super clear which way they're talking about. Yeah, it looks like there's some traffic that they're expecting to be blocked, but isn't. Crash loop back off with termination reason completed. Calico node shouldn't exit. Yeah, that's a little odd. I'll take a look at this one too. Hopefully there's some sort of obvious trace at the end of the previous logs. They linked a different issue that was also mysteriously resolved. Cool, I think we got time for one more here. Yep, so they added this new internal traffic policy to Kubernetes in a recent release. Looks like
I think Tomas was working on this. Is this for BPF mode?
I think that this is for, well, it's not clear. It might be for BPF mode. It may also be for service advertisement. That wouldn't make sense because that's all external. So yeah, maybe we need to follow up on this one. I'll CC Tomas on this as well. Sounds like an enhancement though. So I'll stick that on there. And I'll follow up with a question as well to make sure I understand what they're talking about. But yeah, now that you say it, they're probably talking about eBPF proxy. And I think that brings us right to the end. Thanks for coming, everybody. We've got a month of holidays coming up, so enjoy those. And I will see you all on here in the new year, which will be the second Wednesday, so the 12th of January. Have a good one, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Happy holidays.